Hey everyone, today we're jumping into a really pivotal moment in India's modern history, the 1991 economic crisis. Now, this isn't just a dry chapter in a textbook, it's a dramatic story about how a country on the absolute brink of collapse managed to turn everything around. So, let's get right into it. So I want you to just imagine this for a second. It's 1991. India, a huge country, almost a billion people at the time, finds itself with only enough foreign money to pay for 2 weeks of essential imports. 2 weeks. That's it. We're talking just 14 days before the country could run out of things like petroleum. That's how close to the edge India really was.
So you have to ask, right? How on earth did this happen? I mean, India's economy wasn't just left to chance. It was carefully planned and guided for decades. So how did that meticulous planning lead to a situation this dangerous? Well, that's exactly what we're going to break down today.
Here's our roadmap. We'll start by digging into the crisis itself. Then, we're going to rewind a bit to understand the economic system that was in place from 1950 to 1990. After that, we'll look at the game-changing LPG reforms, see what impact they had, and finally, we'll zoom out and see how India compares to its neighbors. All right, so first up, let's set the scene properly. The year is 1991, and India is staring down the barrel of a perfect economic storm. You can think of this as a dangerous chain reaction. It all kind of started with the government spending way more money than it was bringing in. To cover that gap, it had to borrow heavily from other countries. But soon, India couldn't repay that debt. Confidence just vanished. Foreign currency reserves totally plummeted. And with no money to pay for imports, prices for everything back home started shooting up. By the end, things were so bad that absolutely no one was willing to lend India any more money. It was a vicious cycle just spiraling completely out of control.
Okay, so to really get how India ended up in that mess, we have to go back in time all the way to its independence. We need to look at the economic model that India's founders chose, because that's what set the stage for the next 40 years. So after independence, India's leaders went for what's called a mixed economy. The idea was to get the best of both worlds, right? They wanted the innovation and drive you see in capitalism, but they also wanted the fairness and equity of socialism, where the government would control the really important industries to make sure they served everyone, not just the rich.
And this whole vision was put into action through a series of 5-year plans. You can see the goals here were super ambitious: more growth, modernization, becoming self-reliant, and creating a more equal society. The core idea was that the government could plan the economy to hit these big social goals way faster than if they just let the free market do its thing.
But, and this is a huge but, the main way they controlled the economy became known as the license Raj. To regulate private companies, the government basically required a license for almost everything. Starting a business, expanding it, even deciding how much stuff to make. The goal was control, but what it often created was a mountain of red tape and endless delays. And this right here really captures the two sides of the story. On one hand, the policy did work in some ways. India built up a pretty diverse industrial base, and industry's share of the whole economy grew a lot. But the negatives were just severe. A lot of the government-owned companies were super inefficient and lost tons of money. And that license Raj system, it often got misused by big, established companies to block any new competition, which in the end just choked off growth and new ideas. So by 1991, all those problems had pushed the economy right to the edge. With its back against the wall, India had no choice but to make a radical change. And that brings us to the famous LPG reforms. Completely backed into a corner, India had to go to the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, basically asking for a massive $7 billion bailout. But a loan that big always comes with strings attached. These international agencies said, sure, we'll give you the money, but you have to fundamentally change how your economy works. And that led to the new economic policy. The first pillar of these reforms, the L in LPG, was liberalization. This was a direct assault on the license Raj. The government started tearing down that whole complicated web of controls, getting rid of licenses and restrictions, all to make it easier for private companies to just operate and grow. Next up, the P, privatization. This meant the government was going to step back from being a business owner. It started selling off its stake in many of those public companies, a process we call disinvestment. The whole point was to bring in private money and management to try and make them more efficient. And the final piece of the puzzle, the G, globalization. For decades, India's big focus was on self-reliance, keeping foreign goods and investment out. Well, now, it did a complete 180.
It threw open the doors to the world, slashing trade barriers, making imports easier, and actively inviting foreign companies to come and invest in India.
So they turned the whole system upside down. The big question is, did it work? Let's take a look at the impact these reforms had on India's economy over the next few decades.
Well, if you look at just one key number, economic growth, the answer is a huge, resounding yes. Just look at this chart. In the decade before the reforms, GDP growth was around 5.6%, which is pretty decent. But after 1991, it just exploded, hitting average growth of around 8% for a long time. This was a massive economic takeoff.
But, and there's always a but, isn't there? Growth isn't the whole story. And as this quote from your NCERT textbook points out, a huge criticism started to emerge. All this incredible growth wasn't actually creating enough jobs, and this has been the central debate around the reforms ever since. So let's break down these criticisms a bit. The new growth was really concentrated in the services sector. Think IT, finance, that sort of thing. This created great high-paying jobs, but it didn't do much for the millions of people working in farming or in factories. This led to what people call jobless growth. On top of that, a lot of the new wealth went to people who were already well off, which made inequality worse. And for many workers, it meant to shift to more casual, informal jobs without any kind of safety net.
Now to put India's whole journey into perspective, it's really helpful to see how it compares to its two giant neighbors, China and Pakistan, because they both followed very different paths. And this table tells a really interesting story. While India's growth was impressive, China's was just exponential, driven by manufacturing. And because they focused on mass industrial jobs, they were way more successful at pulling people out of poverty during that time. The other indicators are also pretty revealing. On something like maternal mortality, India does better than Pakistan, but it's way, way behind China. And when it comes to basic things like sanitation, the data shows that just having a high GDP growth rate didn't automatically fix everything. India actually trailed both its neighbors. This really highlights one of the key challenges of the reform era.
And that brings us to the final, really crucial question. There's no doubt the 1991 reforms saved India from a crisis and unlocked incredible economic growth. But the challenge that still remains today is how to make that growth work for everyone. Can the same economic model that created so much wealth also create the millions of good, quality jobs that a young country needs? And can it make sure that prosperity is shared more fairly? Honestly, that's the big question that India is still trying to answer.